My uncle was laid up that winter with sciatica, so when the blizzard stopped and still 2 of the yearlings hadn't come home with the other cattle, Aunt Ellen said I'd better saddle Tim and start looking for them. Then maybe I'll not be back tonight, I told her firmly. Likely they've drifted as far as the sandhills. There's no use coming home without them. I was 13 and had never been away like that all night before, but, busy with breakfast, Aunt Ellen said yes. That sounded sensible enough. And while I ate, hunted up $1 in silver for my meals. Most people wouldn't take it from a lad, but there's strangers up toward the hills. Bring it out independent-like, but don't insist too much. They're more likely to grudge you a feed of oats for Tim. After breakfast, I had to undress again and put on 2 suits of underwear and 2 pairs of thick, home-knitted stockings. It was a clear, bitter morning. After the storm, the drifts lay clean and unbroken to the horizon. Distant farm buildings stood out, distinct against the prairie, as if the thin, sharp atmosphere were a magnifying glass. As I started off, Aunt Ellen peered cautiously out of the door a moment through a cloud of steam and waved a red and white checkered dish towel. I didn't wave back, but conscious of her uneasiness, rode erect, as jaunty as the sheepskin and 2 suits of underwear would permit. We took the road straight for about 3 miles. The cabs, I reasoned, would have by this time found their way home if the blizzard hadn't carried them at least that far. Then we started cater-cornering across fields, riding over to straw stacks where we could see cattle sheltering, calling at farmhouses to ask had they seen any strays. Yearlings, I said each time politely. Red with white spots and faces. The same, almost, except that one's a heifer and the other isn't. Nobody had seen them. There was a crust on the snow not quite hard enough to carry Tim, and despite the cold, his flanks and shoulders were soon steaming. He walked with his head down, and sometimes, taking my sympathy for granted, drew up a minute for breath. My spirits, too, began to flag. The deadly cold and the flat, white, silent miles of prairie asserted themselves like a disapproving presence. The cattle round the straw stacks stared when we rode up as if we were intruders. The field stared, and the sky stared. People shivered in their doorways and said they'd seen no strays. At about 1 o'clock, we stopped at a farmhouse for dinner. It was a single oat sheaf, half thistles for Tim, and fried eggs and bread and tea for me. Crops had been poor that year, they apologized, and though they shook their heads when I brought out my money, I saw the woman's eyes light greedily a second, as if her instincts of hospitality were struggling hard against some urgent need. We too, I said, had had poor crops lately. That was why it was so important that I find the calves. We rested an hour, then went on again. Yearlings, I kept on describing them. Red with white spots and faces. The same, except that one's a heifer and the other isn't. Still no one had seen them. Still it was cold. Still Tim protested what a fool I was. The country began to roll a little. A few miles ahead I could see the first low line of sandhills. They'll be there for sure, I said aloud, more to encourage myself than Tim. Keeping straight to the road, it won't take a quarter as long to get home again. But home now seemed a long way off. A thin white sheet of cloud spread across the sky, and though there had been no warmth in the sun, the fields looked colder and bleaker without the glitter on the snow. Straw stacks were fewer here, as if the land were poor, and every house we stopped at seemed more dilapidated than the one before. A nagging wind rose as the afternoon wore on. Dogs yelped and bayed at us, and sometimes from the hills, like the signal of our approach, there was a thin, wavering howl of a coyote. I began to dread the miles home again almost as much as those still ahead. There were so many cattle straggling across the fields, so many yearlings just like ours. I saw them for sure a dozen times, and as often choked my disappointment down and clicked Tim on again. And then, at last, I really saw them. It was nearly dusk, and along with 15 or 20 other cattle, they were making their way towards some buildings that lay huddled at the foot of the sandhills. They passed in single file, less than 50 yards away, but when I pricked Tim forward to turn them back, he floundered in the snowed-in water cut. By the time we were out, they were a little distance ahead, and on account of the drifts, it was impossible to put on a spurt of speed and pass them. All we could do was take our place at the end of the file and proceed at their pace towards the buildings. It was about half a mile. As we drew near, I debated with Tim whether we should ask to spend the night or start off right away for home. We were hungry and tired, but it was a poor, shiftless-looking place. The yard was littered with old wagons and machinery. The house was scarcely distinguishable from the stables. Darkness was beginning to close in, but there was no light in the windows. Then, as we crossed the yard, we heard a shout. "Stay where you are!" And a man came running towards us from the stable. He was tall and ungainly, and, instead of the short sheepskin that most farmers wear, he had on a long black overcoat nearly to his feet. He seized Tim's bridle when he reached us and glared for a minute as if he were going to pull me out of the saddle. "I told you to stay out," he said in a harsh, excited voice. "You heard me, didn't you? What do you want coming around here anyway?" I steeled myself and said, "Our 2 calves." The muscles of his face were drawn together threateningly, but close to him like this and looking straight into his eyes, I felt that for all their fierce look, there was something about them wavering and uneasy. "The 2 red ones with the white faces," I continued. "They've just gone into the shed over there with yours. If you'll give me a hand getting them out again, I'll start for home right away." He peered at me a minute, let go the bridle, then clutched it again. "They're all mine," he countered. "I was over by the gate. I watched them coming in." His voice was harsh and thick. The strange wavering look in his eyes steadied itself for a minute to a dare. I forced myself to meet it and insisted. "I saw them back a piece in the field. They're ours all right. Let me go over a minute and I'll show you." With a crafty tilt of his head, he leered. "You didn't see any calves. And now, if you know what's good for you, you'll be on your way." "You're trying to steal them," I flared rashly. "I'll go home and get my uncle and the police after you. Then you'll see whether there are calves or not." My threat seemed to impress him a little. With a shifty glance in the direction of the stable, he said, "All right. Come along and look them over. Then maybe you'll be satisfied." But all the way across the yard, he kept his hand on Tim's bridle, and at the shed made me wait a few minutes while he went inside. The cattle shed was a lean-to on the horse stable. It was plain enough. He was hiding the calves before letting me inside to look around. While waiting for him, however, I had time to reflect that he was a lot bigger and stronger than I was, and that it might be prudent just to keep my eyes open and not give him too much insolence. He reappeared carrying a smoky lantern. "All right," he said pleasantly enough. "Come in and look around. Will your horse stand, or do you want to tie him?" We put Tim in an empty stall in the horse stable, then went through a narrow doorway with a bar across it to the cattle shed. Just as I expected, our calves weren't there. There were 2 red ones with white markings that he tried to make me believe were the ones I had seen, but positive I hadn't been mistaken, I shook my head and glanced at the doorway we had just come through. It was narrow, but not too narrow. He read my expression and said, "You think they're in there? Come on then, and look around." The horse stable consisted of 2 rows of open stalls with a passage down the center like an aisle. At the far end were 2 box stalls, one with a sick colt in it, the other closed. They were both boarded up to the ceiling, so that you could see inside them only through the doors. Again he read my expression, and with a nod towards the closed one said, "It's just kind of a harness room now. Up till a year ago, I kept a stallion." But he spoke furtively and seemed anxious to get me away from that end of the stable. His smoky lantern threw great swaying shadows over us, and the deep clefts and triangles of shadow on his face sent a little chill through me and made me think what a dark and evil face it was. I was afraid, but not too afraid. "If it's just a harness room," I said recklessly, "why not let me see inside? Then I'll be satisfied and believe you." He wheeled at my question and sidled over swiftly to the stall. He stood in front of the door, crouched down a little, the lantern in front of him like a shield. There was a sudden stillness through the stable as we faced each other. Behind the light from his lantern, the darkness hovered vast and sinister. It seemed to hold its breath, to watch and listen. I felt a clutch of fear now at my throat, but I didn't move. My eyes were fixed on him so intently that he seemed to lose substance, to loom up close a moment, then recede. At last he disappeared completely, and there was only the lantern like a hard, hypnotic eye. It held me. It held me rooted against my will. I wanted to run from the stable, but I wanted even more to see inside the stall. Wanting to see, yet afraid of seeing. So afraid that it was a relief when at last he gave a shamefaced laugh and said, "There's a hole in the floor. That's why I keep the door closed. If you didn't know, you might step into it. Twist your foot. That's what happened to one of my horses a while back." I nodded as if I believed him, and went back tractably to Tim. But regaining control of myself as I tried the saddle girths, beginning to feel that my fear had been unwarranted, I looked up and said, "It's 10 miles home, and we've been riding hard all day. If we could stay a while, have something to eat, and then get started." The wavering light came into his eyes again. He held the lantern up to see me better, such a long, intense scrutiny that it seemed he must discover my designs. But he gave a nod finally, as if reassured, brought oats and hay for Tim, and suggested, companionably, "After supper we can have a game of checkers." Then, as if I were a grown-up, he put out his hand and said, "My name is Arthur Vickers." Inside the house, rid of his hat and coat, he looked less forbidding. He had a white, nervous face, thin lips, a large straight nose, and deep, uneasy eyes. When the lamp was lit, I fancied I could still see the wavering expression in them, and decided it was what you called a guilty look. "You won't think much of it," he said apologetically, following my glance around the room. "I ought to be getting things cleaned up again. Come over to the stove. Supper won't take long." It was a large, low-ceilinged room that for the first moment or two struck me more like a shed or granary than a house. The table in the center was littered with tools and harness. On a rusty cook stove were 2 big steaming pots of bran. Next to the stove stood a grindstone, then a white iron bed covered with coats and horse blankets. At the end opposite the bed, weasel and coyote skins were drying. There were guns and traps on the wall, a horse collar, a pair of rubber boots. The floor was bare and grimy. Ashes were littered around the stove. In a corner squatted a live owl with a broken wing. He walked back and forth a few times, looking helplessly at the disorder, then cleared off the table and lifted the pots of bran to the back of the stove. "I've been mending harness," he explained. "You get careless living alone like this. It takes a woman, anyway." My presence, apparently, was making him take stock of the room. He picked up a broom and swept for a minute, made an ineffective attempt to straighten the blankets on the bed, brought another lamp out of the cupboard and lit it. There was an ungainly haste to all his movements. He started unbuckling my sheepskin for me, then turned away suddenly to take off his own coat. "Now we'll have supper," he said with an effort at self-possession. "Coffee and beans is all I can give you. Maybe a little molasses." I replied diplomatically that sounded pretty good. It didn't seem right, accepting hospitality this way from a man trying to steal your calves. But theft, I reflected, surely justified deceit. I held my hands out to the warmth and asked if I could help. There was a kettle of plain navy beans already cooked. He dipped out enough for our supper into a frying pan, and on top laid rashers of fat salt pork. While I watched that they didn't burn, he rinsed off a few dishes. Then he set out sugar and canned milk, butter, molasses, and dark, heavy biscuits that he had baked himself the day before. He kept glancing at me so apologetically all the while that I leaned over and sniffed the beans, and said at home I ate a lot of them. "It takes a woman," he repeated as we sat down at the table. "I don't often have anyone here to eat with me. If I'd known, I'd have cleaned things up a little." I was too intent on my plate full of beans to answer. All through the meal he sat watching me, but made no further attempts at conversation. Hungry as I was, I noticed that the wavering, uneasy look was still in his eyes. A guilty look, I told myself again, and wondered what I was going to do to get the calves away. I finished my coffee, and he continued. "It's worse even than this in the summer. No time for meals, and the heat and flies. Last summer I had a girl cooking for a few weeks, but it didn't last. Just a cow she was, a big stupid cow. She wanted to stay on. There's a family of them back in the hills. I had to send her home." I wondered should I suggest starting now or ask to spend the night. Maybe when he's asleep, I thought, I can slip out of the house and get away with the calves. He went on, "You don't know how bad it is sometimes. Weeks on end and no one to talk to. You're not yourself. You're not sure what you're going to say or do." I remembered hearing my uncle talk about a man who had gone crazy living alone. And this fellow Vickers had queer eyes all right. And there was the live owl over in the corner, and the grindstone standing right beside the bed. Maybe I'd better go now, I decided aloud. Tim will be rested, and it's 10 miles home. But he said no, it was colder now, with the wind getting stronger, and seemed so kindly and concerned that I half forgot my fears. Likely he's just starting to go crazy, I told myself, and it's only by staying that I'll have a chance to get the calves away. When the table was cleared and the dishes washed, he said he would go out and bed down the stable for the night. I picked up my sheepskin to go with him, but he told me sharply to stay inside. Just for a minute, he looked crafty and forbidding, as when I first rode up on Tim. And to allay his suspicions, I nodded compliantly and put my sheepskin down again. It was better like that anyway, I decided. In a few minutes I could follow him, and perhaps, taking advantage of the shadows and his smoky lantern, make my way to the box stall unobserved. But when I reached the stable, he had closed the door after him and hooked it from the inside. I walked round a while, tried to slip in by way of the cattle shed, and then had to go back to the house. I went with a vague feeling of relief again. There was still time, I told myself, and it would be safer anyway, when he was sleeping. So that it would be easier to keep from falling asleep myself, I planned to suggest coffee again just before we went to bed. I knew that the guest didn't ordinarily suggest such things, but it was no time to remember manners when there was someone trying to steal your calves. When he came in from the stable, we played checkers. I was no match for him, but to encourage me, he repeatedly let me win. "It's a long time now since I've had a chance to play," he kept on saying, trying to convince me that his short-sighted moves weren't intentional. "Sometimes I used to ask her to play, but I had to tell her every move to make. If she didn't win, she'd upset the board and go off and sulk." "My aunt is a little like that, too," I said. "She cheats sometimes when we're playing cribbage, and when I catch her, says her eyes aren't good." "Women talk too much ever to make good checker players. It takes concentration. This one, though, couldn't even talk like anybody else." After my long day in the cold, I was starting to yawn already. He noticed it and spoke in a rapid, earnest voice, as if afraid I might lose interest soon and want to go to bed. It was important for me to stay awake, so I crowned a king and said, "Why don't you get someone, then, to stay with you?" "Too many of them want to do that." His face darkened a little, almost as if warning me. "Too many of the kind you'll never get rid of again. She did,
last summer when she was here. I had to put her out."
There was silence for a minute, his eyes flashing, and wanting to placate him, I suggested, "She liked you, maybe." He laughed a moment, harshly.
"She liked me, all right. Just 2 weeks ago she came back. Walked over with an old suitcase and said she was going to stay. It was cold at home, and she had to work too hard, and she didn't mind even if I couldn't pay her wages."
I was getting sleepier. To keep awake, I sat on the edge of the chair, where it was uncomfortable, and said, "Hadn't you asked her to come?" His eyes narrowed.
"I had had trouble enough getting rid of her the first time. There were 6 of them at home, and she said her father thought it was time that someone married her."
"Then she must be a funny one," I said. "Everybody knows that the man's supposed to ask the girl." My remark seemed to please him.
"I told you, didn't I?"
he said, straightening a little, jumping 2 of my men.
"She was so stupid that at checkers she'd forget whether she was black or red."
We stopped playing now. I glanced at the owl in the corner and the ashes littered on the floor, and thought that keeping her would maybe have been a good idea after all. He read it in my face and said,
"I used to think that too sometimes. I used to look at her and think that nobody knew now anyway, and that she'd maybe do. You'd need a woman on a farm, all right. And night after night she'd be sitting there where you are. Right there where you are. Looking at me. Not even trying to play."
The fire was low, and we could hear the wind.
"But then I'd go up in the hills, away from her for a while, and start thinking back on the way things used to be. And it wasn't right even for the sake of your meals ready and your house kept clean. When she came back, I tried to tell her that, but all the family are the same. And I realized it wasn't any use. There's nothing you can do when you're up against that sort of thing. The mother talks just like a child of 10. When she sees you coming, she runs and hides. There are 6 of them, and it's come out in every one."
It was getting cold, but I couldn't bring myself to go over to the stove. There was the same stillness now as when he was standing at the box stall door, and I felt the same illogical fear, the same powerlessness to move. It was the way his voice had sunk, the glassy, cold look in his eyes. The rest of his face disappeared. All I could see were his eyes, and they filled me with a vague and overpowering dread. My own voice a whisper, I asked, "And when you wouldn't marry her, what happened then?" He remained motionless a moment, as if answering silently. Then, with an unexpected laugh, like a breaking dish, said, "Why, nothing happened. I just told her she couldn't stay. I went to town for a few days. When I came back, she was gone." "Has she been back to bother you since?" I asked. He made a little silo of checkers.
"No, she took her suitcase with her."
To remind him that the fire was going down, I went over to the stove and stood warming myself. He raked the coals with the lifter and put in poplar, 2 split pieces for a base, and a thick round log on top. I yawned again. He said maybe I'd like to go to bed now, and I shivered and asked him if I could have a drink of coffee first. While it boiled, he stood stirring the 2 big pots of bran. The trouble with coffee, I realized, was that it would keep him from getting sleepy too. I undressed finally and got into bed, but he blew out only one of the lamps and sat on playing checkers with himself. I dozed a while, then sat up with a start, afraid it was morning already and that I'd lost my chance to get the cabs away. He came over and looked at me a minute, then gently pushed my shoulders back on the pillow. "Why don't you come to bed too?" I asked, and he said, "Later I will. I don't feel sleepy yet." It was like that all night. I kept dozing on and off, wakening in a fright each time to find him still there, sitting at his checkerboard. He would raise his head sharply when I stirred, then tiptoe over to the bed and stand close to me, listening, till satisfied again I was asleep. The owl kept wakening too. It was down in the corner, still where the lamplight scarcely reached, and I could see its eyes go on and off like yellow bulbs. The wind whistled drearily around the house. The blankets smelled like an old granary. He suspected what I was planning to do, evidently, and was staying awake to make sure I didn't get outside. Each time I dozed, I dreamed I was on Tim again. The calves were in sight, but far ahead of us, and with the drifts so deep we couldn't overtake them. Then, instead of Tim, it was the grindstone I was straddling, and that was the reason, not the drifts, that we weren't making better progress. I wondered what would happen to the calves if I didn't get away with them. My uncle had sciatica, and it would be at least a day before I could be home and back again with some of the neighbors. By then, Vickers might have butchered the calves or driven them to a hiding place in the hills where we'd never find them. There was the possibility, too, that Aunt Ellen and the neighbors wouldn't believe me. I dozed and woke. Always he was sitting at the checkerboard. I could hear the dry, tinny ticking of an alarm clock, but from where I was lying couldn't see it. He seemed to be listening to it, too. The wind would sometimes creak the house, and then he would give a start and sit rigid a moment with his eyes fixed on the window. It was always the window, as if there was nothing he was afraid of that could reach him by the door. Most of the time he played checkers with himself, moving his lips, muttering words I couldn't hear. But once I woke to find him staring fixedly across the table as if he had a partner sitting there. His hands were clenched in front of him. There was a sharp metallic glitter in his eyes. I lay transfixed, unbreathing. His eyes, as I watched, seemed to dilate, to brighten, to harden like a bird's. For a long time he sat contracted, motionless, as if gathering himself to strike. Then furtively he slid his hand an inch or two along the table toward some checkers that were piled beside the board. It was as if he were reaching for a weapon, as if his invisible partner were an enemy. He clutched the checkers, slipped slowly from his chair, and straightened. His movements were sure, stealthy, silent like a cat's. His face had taken on a desperate, contorted look. As he raised his hand, the tension was unbearable. It was a long time watching him the way you watch a finger tightening slowly in the trigger of a gun. And then suddenly, wrenching himself to action, he hurled the checkers with such vicious fury that they struck the wall and clattered back across the room. And everything was quiet again. I started a little, mumbled to myself as if half awakened, lay quite still. But he seemed to have forgotten me, and after standing limp and dazed a minute, got down on his knees and started looking for the checkers. When he had them all, he put more wood in the stove, then returned quietly to the table and sat down. We were alone again. Everything was exactly as before. I relaxed gradually, telling myself that he'd just been seeing things. The next time I woke, he was sitting with his head half sunk forward on the table. It looked as if he had fallen asleep at last. And huddling alert among the bedclothes, I decided to watch a minute to make sure, then dress and try to slip out to the stable. While I watched, I planned exactly every movement I was going to make. Rehearsing it in my mind as carefully as if I was actually doing it, I climbed out of bed, put on my clothes, tiptoed stealthily to the door, and slipped outside. By this time, though, I was getting drowsy, and relaxing among the blankets, I decided that for safety's sake, I should rehearse it still again. I rehearsed it 4 times altogether, and the 4th time dreamed that I hurried on successfully to the stable. I fumbled with the door a while, then went inside and felt my way through the darkness to the box stall. There was a bright light suddenly, and the owl was sitting over the door with his yellow eyes like a pair of lanterns. The calves, he told me, were in the other stall with the sick colt. I looked, and they were there all right, but Tim came up and said it might be better not to start for home till morning. He reminded me that I hadn't paid for his feed or my own supper yet, and that if I slipped off this way, it would mean that I was stealing too. I agreed, realizing that it wasn't the calves I was looking for after all, and that I still had to see inside the stall that was guarded by the owl.
"Wait here," Tim said. "I'll tell you if he flies away."
and without further questioning, I lay down in the straw and went to sleep again. When I woke, coffee and beans were on the stove already, and though the lamp was still lit, I could tell by the window that it was nearly morning. We were silent through breakfast. 2 or 3 times I caught him watching me, and it seemed his eyes were shiftier than before. After his sleepless night, he looked tired and haggard. He left the table while I was still eating and fed raw rabbit to the owl, then came back and drank another cup of coffee. He had been friendly and communicative the night before, but now, just as when he first came running out of the stable in his long black coat, his expression was sullen and resentful. I began to feel that he was in a hurry to be rid of me. I took my time, however, racking my brains to outwit him still and get the calves away. It looked pretty hopeless now, his eyes on me so suspiciously, my imagination at low ebb. Even if I did get inside the box stall to see the calves, was he going to stand back then and let me start off home with them? Might it not more likely frighten him, make him do something desperate, so that I couldn't reach my uncle or the police? There was the owl over in the corner, the grindstone by the bed, and with such a queer fellow you could never tell. You could never tell, and you had to think about your own skin too. So I said politely, "Thank you, Mr. Vickers, for letting me stay all night," and remembering what Tim had told me, took out my dollar's worth of silver. He gave a short dry laugh and wouldn't take it.
"Maybe you'll come back," he said, "and next time stay longer. We'll go shooting up in the hills if you like, and I'll make a trip to town for things so that we can have better meals. You need company sometimes for a change. There's been no one here now quite a while."
His face softened again as he spoke. There was an expression in his eyes as if he wished that I could stay on now. It puzzled me. I wanted to be indignant, and it was impossible. He held my sheepskin for me while I put it on, and tied the scarf around the collar with a solicitude and determination equal to Aunt Ellen's. And then he gave his short dry laugh again, and hoped I'd find my calves all right. He had been out to the stable before I was awake, and Tim was ready for me, fed and saddled. But I delayed a few minutes, pretending to be interested in his horses and the sick colt. It would be worth something after all, I realized, just to get a glimpse of the calves. Aunt Ellen was going to be skeptical enough of my story as it was. It could only confirm her doubts to hear me say that I hadn't seen the calves in the box stall and was just pretty sure that they were there. So I went from stall to stall, stroking the horses and making comparisons with the ones we had at home. The door, I noticed, he had left wide open, ready for me to lead out Tim. He was walking up and down the aisle, telling me which horses were quiet, which to be careful of. I came to a nervous chestnut mare and realized she was my only chance. She crushed her hips against the side of the stall as I slipped up to her manger, almost pinning me, then gave her head a toss and pulled back hard on the halter shank. The shank, I noticed, was tied with an easy slip knot that the right twist and a sharp tug would undo in half a second. And the door was wide open, ready for me to lead out Tim, and standing as she was with her body across the stall diagonally, I was for the moment screened from sight. It happened quickly. There wasn't time to think of consequences. I just pulled the knot, and in the same instant struck the mare across the nose. With a snort, she threw herself backwards, almost trampling Vickers, then flung up her head to keep from tripping on the shank, and plunged outside. It worked as I hoped it would.
"Quick," Vickers yelled to me. "The gate's open. Try to head her off."
But instead I just waited till he himself was gone, then leaped to the box stall. The door was fastened with 2 tight-fitting slide bolts, one so high that I could scarcely reach it standing on my toes. It wouldn't yield. There was a piece of broken whiffletree beside the other box stall door. I snatched it up and started hammering on the pin. Still it wouldn't yield. The head of the pin was small and round, and the whiffletree kept glancing off. I was too terrified to pause a moment and take careful aim. Terrified of the stall, though, not of Vickers. Terrified of the stall, yet compelled by a frantic need to get inside. For the moment I had forgotten Vickers, forgotten even the danger of his catching me. I worked blindly, helplessly, as if I were confined and smothering. For a moment I yielded to panic, dropped the piece of whiffletree, and started kicking at the door. Then, collected again, I forced back the lower bolt, and picking up the whiffletree, tried to pry the door out a little at the bottom. But I had wasted too much time. Just as I dropped to my knees to peer through the opening, Vickers seized me. I struggled to my feet and fought a moment, but it was such a hard, strangling clutch at my throat that I felt myself go limp and blind. In desperation, then, I kicked him, and with a blow like a reflex, he sent me staggering to the floor. But it wasn't the blow that frightened me. It was the fierce, wild light in his eyes. Stunned as I was, I looked up and saw him watching me, and, sick with terror, made a bolt for Tim. I untied him with hands that moved incredibly, galvanized for escape. I knew now for sure that Vickers was crazy. He followed me outside, and just as I mounted, seized Tim again by the bridle. For a second or two, it made me crazy too. Gathering up the free ends of the rein, I lashed him hard across the face. He let go of the bridle, and frightened and excited too now, Tim made a dash across the yard and out of the gate. Deep as the snow was, I kept him galloping for half a mile, pommeling him with my fists, kicking my heels against his sides. Then, of his own accord, he drew up short for breath, and I looked around to see whether Vickers was following. He wasn't. There was only snow in the hills, his buildings a lonely little smudge against the whiteness, and the relief was like a stick pulled out that's been holding up tomato vines or peas. I slumped across the saddle weakly, until Tim started on again, lay there whimpering like a baby. We were home by noon. We didn't have to cross fields or stop at houses now, and there had been teams on the road packing down the snow so that Tim could trot part of the way and even canter. I put him in the stable without taking time to tie or unbridle him, and ran to the house to tell Aunt Ellen. But I was still frightened, cold, and a little hysterical, and it was a while before she could understand how everything had happened. She was silent a minute, indulgent, then helping me off with my sheepskin, said kindly, "You'd better forget about it now, and come over and get warm. The calves came home themselves yesterday, just about an hour after you set out." I looked up at her. "But the stall then? Just because I wanted to look inside, he knocked me down. And if it wasn't the calves in there?" She didn't answer. She was busy building up the fire and looking at the stew.